What?
Have fun!
I will try. What's more fun than talking about racism?
So many things.
Most things. But we don't shy away from the hard things on this show.
And then we just deal with the crippling depression afterwards.
Well, that's why I drink. Wait, that's already copyrighted, isn't it?
Yeah, that's why we drink. Or
Yeah.
no, podcast. And that's why we drink.
And that's... So I have, and that's why I drink. It's even sadder. Instead of drinking with my friends and talking, it's just me alone in the camera.
Sorry. I'm walking away.
This is not good.
Really?
Where were we?
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Hello, this is Last Call. I'm Brennan Johnson. Let's dive in. So, the war in Ukraine continues, and it's nearly impossible to be unaware of any numerous things taking place between the two countries. From the onslaught of missile attacks bombarding multiple cities, hitting residential areas, government buildings, hospitals, and more, to interactions with unprepared Russian soldiers and the indomitable spirit of the Ukrainian people who we've seen from the multitude of sources standing in sharp defiance to the invading military. But a story that many are keeping an eye on is the growing refugee crisis this war has created, with an upwards of 1 million Ukrainians having already made their way to the borders where they hope to take refuge in neighboring countries, and roughly 10,000 more people showing up at those borders every day. However, the crisis has highlighted a discrepancy and a sort of refugee hierarchy, as it were.
Middle Eastern immigrants among the refugees, these men telling us they believe they've been discriminated against, waiting for their turn for 3 days on that platform, and their turn hasn't come.
It's so hard, bro, you know what I mean?
It's hard.
It's so hard, yeah.
No affirmations,
They treat us at times like trash. You understand? And they look at you with your color, they judge you.
It seems that there has been some sort of policy created that specifies who gets into a country and who is kept out. But why would someone make such calls? When talking about the large number of Ukrainians coming to the border, Bulgarian President Rumen Radev said, "These are not the refugees we are used to. These people are Europeans." Which isn't great, but maybe it was a pull quote, taken out of context and twisted so as to make him appear in bad light. Did he happen to say anything else? Oh yeah, I have it actually right here. Imagine that. These people are intelligent. They are educated people. This is not the refugee wave we have been used to. People we were not sure about their identity, people with unclear pasts, who could have been even terrorists. He added later, in other words, there is not a single European country now which is afraid of the current wave of refugees. So, that is harder to explain away. So, if you're a refugee coming from the Middle East or the northern African countries, then you aren't intelligent or educated, and you have some sort of mysterious past, plus you're probably a terrorist. And I hate to be the one to have this awkward conversation with you, President Radev, but I have it on pretty good authority that in the entire region of the Middle East and in the entire continent of Africa, there are actually quite a few centers of higher learning. But hopefully it was just the president of Bulgaria caught saying these racist things, I know for a fact that the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, was quoted as saying, "We are letting everyone in." So it's good to know that there are some people who are doing the right thing. What's that? In December of last year, he said, "We're not letting anybody in." That's a fast turnaround. What changed from then to now? Oh. Back then, he was talking about refugees from the Middle East and different African countries. And now he's talking about people from Ukraine. So it would appear as if there is some sort of racism problem with the leaders of some countries in Eastern Europe. They're all too happy to help out now in this trying time of need for the people in the nation of Ukraine. But a few months ago, and if we were talking about people from Africa, the Middle East, or parts of Southern Asia, well then, not so much. And I can't judge too harshly. This sort of language and attitude to black and brown individuals is really far too common in our own politics in the States.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
According to the New York Times, he complained that the 15,000 Haitian immigrants who received visas in 2017 all have AIDS. In that very same meeting, the Times reports, he said that once the 40,000 Nigerian immigrants given visas arrived in the U.S., they would never go back to their huts.
It doesn't matter whether we're talking about politicians at home or far away. Far too many of them seem to have this inherent bias that tells them that refugees are worth helping. Refugees won't be a scourge on their nation's economies. Refugees are the perfect example of the least of these from the parables of scriptures that we were raised on in our youth, as long as those refugees happen to look an awful lot like us. But as it turns out, it's not just the politicians who seem to have this kind of dissonance in their brains when talking about refugees. It also seems to be affecting our journalists.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. So it's partly human nature, but they are not in denial.
What the hell? I'm so glad you were careful about how you said that, because if that was careful, I definitely don't want to hear you speak candidly and unbothered. But it wasn't just NBC. In the last few weeks, there has been an outpouring of reporters talking about the tragedy and the horror of what is going on in Ukraine, but their emotional hook seems to be slightly misguided. See if you can find a connection between all of these clips.
Just to put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
And so, of course, I understand and respect the emotion.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
And what's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
Why is it so terrible to know that these refugees are white or Christian or blonde-haired and blue-eyed, or the fact that it's Europe? But where was that sympathy when we were bombing the hell out of Iraq or Syria? Where is that kind of sympathy as Saudi Arabia continues to bomb the hell out of Yemen? And that's not to say that there hasn't been any sort of news reports on these events, but that they were covered in very different ways.
I'm tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield.
And let me be clear. I understand that seeing this horror in a place that's closer to home than you're used to is probably pretty upsetting. If you happen to live in Europe and you see these things happening only 1,000 miles away, I can imagine it's unsettling. But that just means you're now feeling what the people and the reporters and the citizens of countries in and around nations like Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen or Syria or Iran or the host of other countries have been feeling for generations now. That fighting is happening just a little too close for comfort. And, those people suffering look an awful lot like us. It's all a little uncomfortable. Maybe a way to use this fear is not to be aghast that something like this is happening in Europe, But isn't it horrible that the way we feel right now is how millions of people feel all the time because of the actions of our governments? But this leads me to a larger point that I want to make here. What's happening in Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people is horrible. It's awful, and they don't deserve it. But they don't deserve it because they look like me, or because they're Christian, or blonde hair and blue eyes, or because they dress nice, or because they're European. This is heartbreaking and horrific because these are human beings. Which means it's just as sad when it happens in the Middle East or any country in Africa or Asia. And our politicians should talk about those crises just like they talk about Ukraine. And our news reports should be presenting those stories with the same feeling of atrocity as they're doing now. And so this leads me to the last thing I want to touch on tonight. Empathy. Consider it the word of the day. Unless that's copyrighted, then let's call it the theme of the week, or something better. We'll workshop titles later. We'll put the name down below. You'll see the name that we're going to be calling it, whatever it happens to be. Empathy is something that we all need to be feeling right now for a multitude of reasons and for a multitude of people around the world. Like, it's no secret that when people are going through hard times and those people happen to look like us, then we are more inclined to have empathy. Our brains swap their faces out with our own faces or the faces of our loved ones, and suddenly our hearts go out to those people. But empathy only for those who live like us or look like us or act like us is dangerous, and it can seriously affect the lives and the well-beings of others. And it's not a luxury that millions of people of color get to have. Because if you're of a certain age, you grew up in a time when if a cast was entirely made up of white people, you wouldn't bat an eye. Like, for example, or you know what, just to save time, let's just roll through a few shows, just because it's going to be too long otherwise. I mean, yeah, fair enough. And Black and Indigenous people of color have had to listen and put up with the media telling them that they just have to relate to these characters for years. But over the last few years, media has tried to be more intentional about diversifying its cast and who is even behind the camera creating the shows and the movies. People who are also intentional about who they are casting and why. But the outcry to that has been pervasive and frankly, well, stupid.
What precisely is diversity our strength? Since you've made this our new national motto, please be specific as you explain it. Can you think, for example, of other institutions, such as, I don't know, marriage or military units, in which the less people have in common, the more cohesive they are? Do you get along better with your neighbors or your coworkers if you can't understand each other or share no common values? Please be honest as you answer this question.
30% of secondary roles under this new deal are going to have to be filled by, made up of people from at least 2 underrepresented racial groups. This is the death of art.
How am I, a white man, ever supposed to identify with someone who isn't white? Oh, the horror! The pigmentation of that person's skin is different than mine own, and as such I am unable to relate to them or empathize with them. Cancel that show! I want more white people. I really hope that clip isn't taken out of context at some point in my life. But it's ridiculous that anyone could ever complain about not being able to see themselves in any character on TV or movie when that's the kind of bull that anyone who isn't white has been asked to do for years. It's what makes the stories of kids seeing characters who look like them just so damn cute.
Moviegoers are enchanted with Encanto. The impact this story is having goes far beyond the big screen. Especially for 2-year-old Kenzo Brooks, who sat down for family movie night and saw Antonio. Notice the resemblance?
I truly believe that he thought it was him just his reaction. He kept staring at the screen, then like, looking back at us and like just smiling.
Kenzo's family sharing the image on social media with the hashtag representation matters.
For me, it did make me feel a little bit emotional just to think that my son was able to see this and have this experience. And just for so many other Black and brown boys and girls to be able to have that same experience.
The point of me saying this is that it's kind of fucking ridiculous that white people would complain about the lack of white people in media when, one, white people are still everywhere in media, and they're using talking points that they have actively ignored from people of color to do it. Which is why tweets and news reporters asking us to just imagine if this was happening in America ring so hollow. Because it has fucking happened in America, and often. Here's a map of just some settler massacres of indigenous people ranging from 1539 to 1890 in the United States from the Decolonial Atlas. As you can see, this is only some because confrontations between settlers and indigenous people were so frequent here, they often didn't just write them down, so we don't have records of them. Multiple of these massacres saw over 200 people killed. Similarly, here's a map of Black massacres that have taken place in the country. And before you come at me and say, well, Brennan, I'm seeing a lot of 1800s on that map, and we all know that the 1800s was a terrible time. But then the Civil War happened, and then the Civil Rights Movement happened. Okay, well then explain to me Detroit, 1943. Or how about Philadelphia, 1985? Or Charleston, 2015? That was only 7 years ago. This isn't even touching on the labor camps that were set up during World War II, the entire history of mistreating women or anyone in the LGBTQIA+ community, the hate that the Asian community has gone through in response to COVID-19, and more. I could go on, but this is a comedy show and I'm getting sad. The point of this is that we shouldn't need news reporters wailing, "This is Europe!" for people saying, "Imagine if this was America," for us to care about sad and dark shit. In fact, saying this is America has the same energy as dads who say things like, "Now that I have daughters, I can't help but feel and imagine like it's my girls when I see women being mistreated." It shouldn't have to take having daughters to care about women being mistreated. You shouldn't have to imagine that it's in America or seeing that the people who are suffering kind of look like you for you to care about them. Humans are human, whether they're white or black or brown, whether they come from the continent of Europe or anywhere else in the world. Suffering should be seen as suffering without some kind of extra qualifying factor like skin color or eye color or if you dress like you're middle class or not. It becomes amazingly easier to sniff through the proverbial bullshit when you realize that centuries of systemic white supremacy still carry weight in the way things are talked about or are seen by others. Taking just a little bit more time to dive deeper into stories and realize that the stories that people seem to care about now in specific cases are also happening all over the world and have been going on for a while, and maybe there's a reason one story is getting more coverage than the other. That's not to say that we shouldn't care about Ukraine. This isn't to say that we shouldn't be invested in what's happening there. But we should be mindful that there are tons of people who feel the way we do about Ukraine only about their home countries or about people who look a little more like them. That there are people who don't have to imagine what it would be like to have these atrocities happen at home because they have happened at home. In this way, if we keep our eyes and our ears and our minds open to the atrocities around the world, then maybe we can do a better job at pointing out when we see those horrible things. And we can do our part to keep the people committing these horrible things accountable, much like the world is doing by pointing at Putin right now. And in this way, we just might be able to make the world a little bit better of a place. So, thank you so much for watching this if you did. Like all YouTube videos, there's the things you can do like subscribing and liking, all of that. I'm not gonna talk about that. You get it. Again, it's 2022. If you don't know how YouTube works, thank you for being here, I guess. I don't know how you got here in the first place. But yeah, cheers. See you next time. I'm not drinking sophisticated whiskey for this video because my wife bought seltzers. And
Do you know
she's
your
like,
microphone's unplugged?
well, now I do. How's it going, Internet? And that's why I drink.
No.
I wanted like a 1-second joke.
And now you have like 20 minutes of
I have
bumpers.
so much material to use for the bumpers.